The Honourable Taylor Martin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak today on the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill 2017 and to explain why I will be voting against the bill. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge up front that the concept of assisted dying resonates with many on face value or when initially prompted for their response. I believe this is the case because our hearts ache when we hear of people who have a difficult end-of-life experience. We have parents, spouses, siblings and friends who have suffered terribly in the final weeks and days of their lives, and we wish to take that pain away for them. When people contemplate their own or their loved one's mortality, we hope for a departure from this life to be swift and uncomplicated. When we witness the suffering of others or when we ponder our own death, it is easy to reach the conclusion that we should allow any means to cease the pain. I don't want to diminish this view because at its core, assisting those that we love is what it means to be human. To act on your emotions, to remove their suffering, is to act out of compassion. Today, however, we must consider all the consequences of sanctioning suicide. We cannot consider just the heartache that comes from witnessing a loved one's pain. It is our obligation as legislators to objectively consider all outcomes and strive to investigate to the best of our ability all unintended consequences that would arise from legalising suicide. Assisted suicide is legal in so few places in the world that barely 5% of the world's population live in a jurisdiction that allows it. I don't think it would be wise for Australia or New South Wales to become an early adopter. I do not believe that our population should be one of the first few jurisdictions to attempt to work through implementing such a scheme as this. I belong to a demographic where the number one cause of death is suicide. It is a tragic problem which affects young people disproportionately. Growing up, 3 close friends of mine attempted to commit suicide by 3 very different means, each of them in an effort to end their own suffering and helplessness from depression. Of all the reasons why one should vote against legalising suicide, this is the one that troubles me personally the most. Of those 3 people, they are still with us today because they realised after having been hospitalised that it is in fact wrong to take a life, even if it is one's own. To legalise and to normalise suicide would, in my opinion, permanently change society's long-held view that life is sacred and that we do not take life away in a civilised society. Studies show that this has been the case in jurisdictions where they have allowed this normalisation of suicide. Oregon, for example, has seen a suicide rate which has steadily increased from the year 2000. The rate of suicide in Oregon is 42% higher than the national average in the USA, according to the state's health authority. Normalising any form of suicide will change our view of death. It makes it an acceptable alternative to pain, physical and possibly even mental. When we are close to death, we look towards healthcare professionals to reduce our pain and suffering with the understanding that sometimes it may be futile. But I don't understand how this has been reduced to what Dr. Curry in his letter to me described as the misguided concept that to kill is to do good. One of the main reasons why Australia stopped the barbaric practice of capital punishment is because it is so final. We would not reconsider the death penalty, primarily because we fear the circumstance of having even one innocent person put to death. We must consider this bill through a similar lens. As I look around at each of you here today, I ask, are you personally prepared to wear the responsibility that approving suicide will put on our shoulders? Are you prepared to say here today that if just one person takes the option of assisted suicide who was falsely diagnosed or felt pressured to relieve a perceived burden that they felt they placed on their family, you must ask yourself if you believe you are okay with that. When most supporters of assisted suicide think about the pain and suffering that is being experienced or was experienced or will be experienced, they view this through the prism of how their own family would approach a loved one's pain. But we must make the law for everyone. I say to my colleagues, you, me, our own families, we are all lucky to belong to the families that we do, but others will not be in such a situation. There is no safeguard strong enough to prevent the change that this will bring about in our society. It is not far-fetched to imagine that this bill will result in people dying who should not have. It is not unlikely to imagine a scenario where an elderly person who is incredibly sick and in terrible pain yet still yearns for life but feels pressured by family to be assisted to suicide and cease to be a burden. It is not far-fetched to imagine a scenario where somebody is given a terminal diagnosis when it may not actually be the case. Some will argue against the breaking of the Hippocratic Oath. Some have argued that doctors cannot in fact predict the term until death with the degree of accuracy necessary for the process in this bill to reflect reality. Some believe that this would create two tiers of patient care: those whose lives we honour and strive to maintain and improve, and those who we decide are not worthy to continue assisting and caring for, as they will receive permission to die and receive the lethal prescription. I've heard from many who are concerned that this is a threshold that once crossed, once this is allowed, there will be no way back, with the only way to go being further and further down the road, loosening the restrictions in years to come, perhaps to include mental health issues, or even to lower the age from the 25 years of age that this bill specifies. I do not believe it is far out of the realms of possibility to see that in the future, in future parliamentary terms, that this legislation, if passed, would be amended to loosen the conditions of eligibility. As my fellow members will know, we have all received an inordinate amount of correspondence on this important topic in months gone by. One particular piece of correspondence came to me from Rita. Rita wrote to me to tell me about her diagnosis that gave her a timeline of just 1 month to live. That was 6 years ago. She received excellent medical care, but despite this, she still experienced pain and side effects from the medication. It is not far-fetched to imagine a scenario where someone like Rita opts for assisted suicide and deprives herself, her family, and her community of those additional years. I received a significant amount of correspondence from doctors and nurses involved in palliative care and organisations that represent these medical professionals. The correspondence I received from these groups was near universal in its opposition to assisted suicide. This opinion was reflected in the result of a survey of Australian Medical Association members, which found that those doctors who regularly deliver end-of-life care to patients are those that have the greatest opposition to euthanasia and assisted suicide. So we have an issue to address. How do we, as a society, provide for our most vulnerable when they are mentally and physically drained, when they are in their final days on earth, and they are not the same as they once were? Well, Mr. Deputy President, allow me to quote from Dr. Richard Chai, who is the Director of Palliative Care at St Vincent's. My view, after a lifetime's work in palliative care, having stood at the bedside of thousands of dying people, is that none of the issues that brings us to this point will be solved by introducing assisted suicide. What will help requires more of ourselves, our institutions and authorities, adequate funding of quality palliative care for all, and nothing short of a revolutionary change in the way we discuss, respond to and accept death, both as individuals and as a society. Almost every aspect of the way our society approaches death, including within healthcare, needs rethinking. He continues, no terminally ill Australian should ever find themselves in the position of being unable to experience quality palliative care, but able to access assisted suicide. And I am proud to be part of a government that has recognised and is investing heavily into palliative care services, with an additional $100 million over the next 4 years going into training over 300 nurses and allied health staff, an additional 30 palliative care nurses in New South Wales, additional palliative care services in rural and regional areas, and funding to better integrate palliative care in with current health services. Mr. Deputy President, I do not accept, and I know many of my colleagues do not accept, and many of the people of New South Wales do not accept, the proposition that dignity is about the choice to die, but the choice to live and to be among us all, even in the most insidious of circumstances imaginable, physical or mental. Thank you.